Explosions, heroics, and dramatic speeches. That's how movies show World War II. But what if a lot of what we think we know about the war is flat out wrong? In this video, we're breaking down 10 of the biggest WWII myths that Hollywood keeps repeating, and we're going to separate cinematic fiction from historical reality. You've seen them all: the lone American hero winning the war, Nazis with endless superweapons, clean battles with clear good guys and bad guys, and a D-Day that looks like the entire war in one day. Some of these myths are harmless. Others completely distort how and why the war was actually fought, and who really paid the price. Stay with me, because some of these might challenge scenes from your favorite movies. By the end, you'll watch every WWII film with a much sharper eye, and probably spot the myths before the credits even roll. Before we jump into the myths, quick context. Movies are built to entertain, not teach history. Directors compress years into hours, merge characters, and turbocharge drama. The problem is, for many of us, films are our main source of knowledge about World War II. In this video, we're focusing on 10 of the most common misconceptions that pop up again and again in Hollywood. From D-Day to the Eastern Front, from resistance fighters to Nazi technology. We'll look at where the myth came from, how movies show it, and what historians actually say. If you're into deep dive, no-nonsense history that still respects great filmmaking, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing and tapping the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming episodes on Cold War myths and Vietnam movie mistakes. And definitely watch through to the end. I'll wrap up with a quick checklist you can use to judge whether any war film is even remotely accurate. Myth number 1. The United States won World War II almost by itself. Hollywood loves the lone American savior narrative. In many films, especially older ones, the British, Soviets, and other allies appear as background characters while US troops and commanders do nearly everything important. Reality? The war was a brutally complex coalition effort. The Soviet Union bore the heaviest combat burden in Europe, losing roughly 27 million people and grinding down the bulk of the German army on the Eastern Front. Britain and the Commonwealth fought from day one, enduring bombing campaigns, naval battles, and North African campaigns long before US troops arrived. China tied down huge Japanese forces for years. American industry, logistics, and manpower were absolutely crucial, particularly from 1943 onward. But the victory was collective. Movies that treat it as a solo American win tell a comforting story and erase the sacrifice of millions of non-American soldiers and civilians. Myth number 2. D-Day was the decisive battle that basically won the war. In popular imagination and countless films, D-Day is the single, towering moment of World War II. The suggestion is, once the Allies landed in Normandy, German defeat was inevitable and not far off. In truth, D-Day was a massive and crucial operation, but it was one part of a much longer, grinding war. By June 1944, Germany had already suffered catastrophic losses in the east at Stalingrad, Kursk, and through continuous Soviet offensives. The German army was bleeding men and equipment on multiple fronts under constant Allied bombing. The Normandy campaign itself wasn't just the beach landings. It was weeks of brutal hedgerow fighting, high casualties, and stalled advances. Even after France was liberated, the war dragged on for almost another year. Movies that treat D-Day as a clean, decisive knockout punch drastically oversimplify a messy attritional struggle. Myth number 3. The war in Europe was mainly fought in the West. Western movies naturally focus on US, British, and Canadian troops in France, Italy, and the Low Countries. Iconic films barely mention what was happening thousands of kilometers away on the Eastern Front. Historically, the European war's center of gravity was in the East. From 1941 to 1945, the majority of German divisions, tanks, and casualties were tied up fighting the Soviet Union. Battles like Stalingrad, Kursk, and Operation Bagration dwarfed Western Front clashes in scale and losses. This doesn't diminish the courage of Western Allied soldiers. Instead, it restores perspective. The Western Front opened a vital second front, shortened the war, and forced Germany to split its strength. But when movies imply that Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Italian campaign were the whole European story, they erase the colossal, brutal struggle between Nazi Germany and the USSR that consumed the bulk of the German war machine. Myth number 4. All German soldiers were fanatical Nazis. In movies, German troops are often portrayed as interchangeable villains, completely devoted to Hitler and Nazi ideology. Black uniforms, snarling faces, and constant references to the Führer create the impression of a monolithic, ideologically unified enemy. Reality is more complicated. The Nazi regime was absolutely driven by genocidal ideology, and many units, especially SS formations, were deeply committed to it and responsible for horrific crimes. But the German military also contained conscripts, reluctant draftees, and older reservists who were not party members. Some quietly resisted, deserted, or surrendered at the first chance. This doesn't excuse the Wehrmacht's extensive involvement in war crimes, especially in the East. It does remind us that vast armies are made up of individuals with different motivations, fears, and beliefs. Reducing every German soldier to a cartoon Nazi villain can obscure how ordinary people became part of an extraordinarily criminal system. Myth number 5. The French barely fought and surrendered immediately. The caricature of France as a nation that simply gave up in 1940 shows up in jokes, throwaway lines, and even dialogue in war movies. Often the only French heroes on screen are resistance fighters blowing up trains years later. The truth? France fielded one of the largest armies in Europe and suffered around 90,000 dead in the 6-week Battle of France. They fought major armored battles, conducted counterattacks, and held defensive lines while being outflanked through the Ardennes, something their high command had badly underestimated. After defeat, collaborationist Vichy France existed, but so did Free French forces under de Gaulle, fighting alongside allies in North Africa, Italy, and the liberation of France. The internal resistance grew stronger over time. By portraying 1940 as a simple collapse caused by cowardice, films erase strategic mistakes, German operational brilliance, and the very real blood price paid by French soldiers and civilians. Myth number 6. The atomic bombs alone forced Japan's surrender. Many depictions of the Pacific War treat Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the single obvious turning point. Bombs drop, Japan instantly surrenders, war over. It's a clean, dramatic narrative that fits tightly into a movie's third act. In reality, Japan was already strategically defeated, enduring naval blockade, firebombing, and looming famine. The atomic bombings were devastating and shocking, but another event weighed heavily: the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan in August 1945. Smashing Japanese forces in Manchuria. Japan's leadership was divided. Some wanted conditional surrender, others favored fighting on in hopes of better terms. The combination of nuclear devastation, Soviet invasion, and the loss of any hope for mediation pushed the emperor and key leaders toward accepting Allied terms. This doesn't minimize the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It does show that Japan's surrender was the result of multiple converging pressures, not a simple one-cause moment. Myth number 7. WWII combat was constant heroics and non-stop action. Films condense war into a sequence of intense firefights, bayonet charges, and last-second rescues. The impression: soldiers spent most of their time in high adrenaline battle. Veterans' accounts paint a different picture: long stretches of boredom, fear, and fatigue punctuated by short, chaotic bursts of violence. Marching, digging, waiting, cleaning weapons, dealing with illness and cold, these filled far more hours than dramatic assaults. When combat did happen, it was often confusing and terrifying, with limited visibility, friendly fire risks, and decisions made with poor information. Many deaths came from artillery, mines, disease, and accidents rather than cinematic duels. Movies understandably focus on the exciting parts. But when they erase the grinding routine, logistical headaches, and mental strain, they create a glamorous version of war that can hide just how exhausting, disorganized, and miserable life at the front really was. Myth number 8. Resistance movements were everywhere and highly effective. Cinema loves underground fighters, sabotage missions, clandestine meetings, coded messages in cafes. The message is often that occupied Europe was a hotbed of active, organized resistance constantly striking at the occupiers. Reality varied dramatically by country, region, and year. In many places, resistance was small, fragmented, and ruthlessly persecuted. Informers, reprisals, and limited resources made large-scale operations extremely risky. Some occupied populations were passive, trying simply to survive. Others included collaborators. Where resistance did grow strong, Yugoslavia, parts of France, Poland, Greece, it depended on local conditions, geography, and external support. Even then, operations were often limited, with harsh reprisals on civilians when they succeeded. By portraying resistance as universal and always heroic, movies can unintentionally downplay the terror of occupation and the moral gray zones people faced. Cooperate, resist, or just try to keep your family alive under a regime that could kill you for doing nothing at all. Myth number 9. Nazi Germany was on the verge of superweapons that could have won the war. Films and documentaries love secret bases, Wunderwaffe, and last-minute doomsday devices, advanced jets, missiles, even occult projects that suggest Germany almost turned the tide with technology. Germany did pursue advanced weapons, the V-2 rocket, jet fighters like the Me-262, experimental submarines, but these projects were plagued by resource shortages, production chaos, strategic confusion, and Allied bombing. Most appeared too late, in too few numbers, or with reliability issues to change the war's outcome. Meanwhile, Allied technological advantages in code-breaking, radar, mass production, and logistics quietly mattered more. A jet fighter is impressive. Thousands of reliable trucks and cargo ships win campaigns. The myth of the almost victorious Nazi super science can border on dangerous admiration. It suggests a kind of dark genius, when in reality the regime's scientific efforts were undermined by ideology, infighting, and catastrophic strategic decisions. Myth number 10. The Holocaust was separate from the war and mostly known later. In many war films, the Holocaust appears only at the end. A liberated camp, shocked soldiers, a revelation of evil that seems almost disconnected from the main military storyline. Historically, the genocide of Jews and other targeted groups was deeply woven into Nazi war policy, especially in Eastern Europe. Einsatzgruppen followed the army, conducting mass shootings. Ghettos, deportations, and extermination camps were part of a vast system that grew alongside military operations. Knowledge was uneven, but there were reports, intelligence intercepts, and eyewitness accounts reaching the Allies during the war. Many details weren't widely understood, but the basic fact of mass murder was not a complete surprise in 1945. Separating the Holocaust from the military narrative makes it seem like a horrific side plot instead of a central goal of the regime. Accurate portrayals show how genocide and conquest were intertwined from the very beginning. Myth number 11. WWII was a clean good versus evil war with clear moral lines on the battlefield. Films often present Allied forces as uniformly noble and restrained, while Axis forces commit all atrocities. The war becomes a story of pure heroism versus pure villainy. Morally, there is no question about the nature of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and their policies. But on the ground, combat was messier. Allied forces also committed war crimes, bombings that incinerated civilians, summary executions, abuse of prisoners, and violent reprisals at times. Recognizing this doesn't create false moral equivalence. It acknowledges human complexity. Good causes can be pursued with brutal methods, and individual soldiers on any side can act heroically or criminally. When movies sanitize Allied behavior, they make war look cleaner and simpler than it was. Honest portrayals can still honor veterans while admitting that victory came through strategies and actions that often inflicted terrible suffering on ordinary people. Let's quickly recap the biggest myths we've untangled. First, no single nation or battle won WWII alone. It was a brutal multinational grind, with the Eastern Front absolutely central. Second, everyday reality for soldiers was more boredom, fear, and logistics than non-stop heroics. Third, not every German was a fanatical Nazi, and not every occupied citizen was a fearless resistance fighter. Real people lived in gray zones shaped by terror and survival. We've also seen that Nazi superweapons were more fantasy than war-winning reality, that Japan's surrender came from multiple converging shocks, and that the Holocaust wasn't some separate epilogue, but core to Nazi policy throughout the war. Finally, we challenge the idea of a clean, morally simple conflict where only one side committed atrocities. Understanding these nuances doesn't diminish sacrifice. It deepens our respect by seeing the war as it was, not as Hollywood wishes it had been. So, what do you do with all of this the next time you press play on a WWII movie? Use these myths as a mental checklist. Ask, whose perspective is missing? What fronts are ignored? Is the enemy shown as a faceless horde? Are resistance fighters, superweapons, or clean combat exaggerated for drama? When the end credits roll, that's your cue to dig deeper. If you found this breakdown useful and want more long-form history that respects both facts and filmmaking, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming episodes on Cold War spy myths and Vietnam on screen. Drop a comment with the WWII movie you think gets it most right or most wrong, and why. Share this video with someone who loves war films, and maybe rewatch your favorites together with a more critical eye. Entertainment is great. Understanding is better.